Good morning, this is Omar Mohammed and this is our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism. Today we will talk about anti-Semitism in France and our guest speaker is Simone Rodan-Benzaquen from the American Jewish Committee in Paris. Welcome, Simone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
Would you be kind and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I was born in Germany, actually. I'm what could be described as a wandering Jew. I was born in Germany. My parents come from Romania. They escaped communism. And then I moved around in Europe. I have lived in the United Kingdom. I've lived in Switzerland. I've lived in Belgium, and I have now lived in France for over 20 years. I have believed that for a very long time that the fight against anti-Semitism is not only a fight for Jews, but it's a fight for humanity and for preserving liberal democracy. So for many decades now, I have been involved in this on behalf of the American Jewish Committee, and the American Jewish Committee is the largest American Jewish organization that was, it's also the oldest, that was created in 1906, that has been fighting on the issue for far too long.
Thank you. As we do in all our episodes in this series of 5 seasons, we ask this question. What is the definition of anti-Semitism?
So let me maybe give you a very short one, and then one that is more sort of, I would say, official. The first one, the very short one, I would say anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that mutates like a virus over time, over centuries, and that latches itself onto what we say in French, l'air du temps. The moment of the day, the societal evolutions of the day. Anti-Semitism used to be of religious nature at one time, then it became of scientific nature, the issue of race, and now it has changed and transformed into itself in something that hides behind anti-racism, anti-colonialism, feminism, and that latches on what is today the issue of the day. The sort of more formal definition of anti-Semitism, I think, is very important, is the working definition of anti-Semitism. The working definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was created in 2002 at a time when anti-Semitism really started to appear here in Europe. And one of the difficulties at the time was that many politicians didn't understand what was happening because in their mind, anti-Semitism was Nazism, was what was known in the Third Reich, and the fact that something new was happening, that it was taking a new form of anti-Semitism. They didn't know how to define it. So you can't fight something if you don't know how to define it. And so they adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism that has since then been adopted by dozens and dozens of countries, including France. France adopted both in parliament and on the state level. And let me just give you and quote you the working definition. It then goes into examples. But what it says is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So that's the official one. Then it goes into examples. And one of the examples, and that's why it's very, very important, is defines anti-Semitism with relations to Israel hatred. And for example, I won't go in all of it, but for example, what it says is accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interest of their own nations, denying the Jewish people the rights to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. So there are many, many other examples in there, but it's interesting because I think we're a little bit, since October 7th, in that air du temps, and we're hearing much and much of this, and I think one of the difficulties that we are facing is that people have difficulties of understanding that what they are doing and what they are saying is actually anti-Semitic.
In fact, based on the definition you have made, we have seen the manifestation of almost everything you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely.
Under the guise of supporting what's going on in Gaza and many other manifestations on campus, etc. And today we are recording from Paris, France. What's the current state of anti-Semitism in France?
The current state is very concerning. We have had a 1,000% increase of anti-Semitic acts over the past year. We have to understand that since October 7th, since Hamas attacked Israeli civilians, murdered, tortured, raped, and then took hostage many others, we've really seen an explosion of anti-Semitism here in France. Some argue that this is only happening because Israel has militarily retaliated, and that's simply untrue, because on October 7th, the spike started. The week of October 7th, where Israel hadn't yet retaliated, is the highest week of anti-Semitic acts in France. So we are seeing something that we knew would happen. It's, by the way, also not a coincidence that right on October 8th, the French Minister of Interior already announced that he would be protecting specifically Jewish community sites. It's because we knew. We knew that the event itself of October 7th, the horrific things that we had seen, would unleash an anti-Semitic passion. So we have the act on the one hand, so that's violence, it's insults, it's a lot of violence, it's threats, and then we have what I would call a sort of an anti-Semitism that exists as chatter, that is in the atmosphere, and that is allowing for the anti-Semitic violence to take place. So it's the political discourse. It's the political discourse in particular on the far left of Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, of the France Insoumise, which has basically turned itself into what we have seen previously in the United Kingdom under Jeremy Corbyn, where disguised behind attacks against Israel, disguised behind anti-Zionism, there is an obsession on specifically targeting Jews, Israel, and Zionism. It's when you look at the Twitter accounts of most members of Parliament of La France Insoumise, they will maybe have one tweet about Russia, maybe one tweet about Syria, and that's probably it. And you will have 1,000 tweets since October 7th on Gaza, on Israel, on the criminalization of Israel, of Zionism, and of Jews. So that's politically what's happening. And then you have something that is going on societally, where you have university campuses, and we're here at Sciences Po, we have seen only over the last days, Jewish students who were banned from going into university because they were accused of being Zionists, We have Jewish students who for months now have told us that they're afraid, to go to university, that they're afraid to speak to people because they're constantly under pressure, constantly interrogated on whether they are support for Zionism or Israel, which is the essence of racism. And we have a sort of atmospheric anti-Semitism that is very, 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 very present in public discourse, and in particular on social media. So the explosion of anti-Semitism really on social media, I've personally experienced, there's these days I can't post something on Twitter without getting death threats, without getting insulted, without getting, the worst of all kinds, and that's the case for most people. So that has led to a very, very serious situation, and it has also led to a situation where, frankly, Jews are afraid. And Jews are we used to say for homosexuals that they're in the closet because they're afraid to show their sexuality. Jews are being forced into the closet. So Jews won't use their Jewish identity. People change their behaviors. They will not use Jewish sounding names on delivery apps. People take off their name tags on their doorbells. Will take the mezuzah, the religious symbol, off their doors. That won't wear kippah in the streets. And by the way, we have seen attacks against Jews who had visible Jewish symbols in the streets. So people are afraid. It's nothing new, but it's gone to a very, very, very different level. It is as if October 7th had sort of allowed for something to be unleashed, as if sort of a anti-Semitic passion has been authorized. Hamas said we want a global jihad to take place. Global jihad is taking place.
It's terrifying what you mentioned, Simone, and it matches many of the stories I heard from friends. And it's a terrifying reality that Jewish communities, whether in Israel or around the world, and especially here in France, are not feeling safe anymore. That they are afraid for their safety, that they have to hide their Jewishness. Why is this increase in anti-Semitism in France? What is the background? I believe you already mentioned many important elements, but why it's happening in France?
So first of all, the reality is today it's happening everywhere. I don't think there is a country today that is safe. You look at America, you look at Australia, you look at Germany, you look at Spain, you look at the Netherlands. I mean, the list goes on. There is not one single country that is safe. And I think there are a number there. I mean, I pointed towards some of them. There are a number of reasons. Fundamentally, I think anti-Semitism it's a canner to say it these days, but it's the canary in the coal mine. The idea that the miners used to take little birds, canaries, into the mine, and when there was gas in the mine, the canary would die, and that they knew that there was a risk that the mine would explode. So in history and in society, we know that anti-Semitism is always the first sign of societies falling apart, of profound problems within our society. And I think that this is what we are seeing today. I think we are going through a very profound crisis in our liberal democracies. we are seeing polarization, we are seeing radicalization, we are seeing Islamist extremism, we are seeing political extremism on the left, political extremism on the right. And Jews are always the first ones. Jews are the ones historically that, I said early on, anti-Semitism, I think, is a conspiracy theory. If things don't go well, if a society is unhappy, what better way to find than this tiny, tiny little minority that people have believed for centuries to be controlling the world? The difference between racism and anti-Semitism is that racism, people believe that the visible people are below, are not worthy, are inferior. With anti-Semitism, it's exactly the opposite. Is people believe that Jews are above and that they are controlling things and that they are at a place where they shouldn't be, which should be my place. So it's just a reinvention of exactly that idea. And at a time when societies have forgotten that what they should be defending is liberal democracy, that the world order that we created since the Second World War is worth fighting for. Young people have forgotten that, it's not normal to be able to, you come from a place where it's not normal to be able to vote, and it's not normal to able to have liberties and freedom, and it's not able to, you don't have the right to have, your sexuality or your freedom of expression, and people have forgotten that. And so I think it's societies are falling apart. Our liberal democracies are falling apart, and in that, anti-Semitism is playing its first role. And we have seen it in France, I think, for the past 2 decades. It really started very early years, in the early years of 2000, where several things coincided. 9/11, the increase of Islamist extremism, including, of course, here in France. I mean, when we look back, we had people celebrating 9/11 here in France. We had the Second Intifada, and the issue of the importation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the identification with certain people from immigrant communities with the Palestinian cause, romanticizing something that had nothing to do with reality. People who came themselves from a colonial background and projected their own understanding of what colonialism is onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the third thing, I think, the falling apart of universalism, which we saw in particular with the Durban II conference that happened a few days before 9/11. Very interesting, actually. And which was supposed to be a conference against racism, and that turned itself into a hate festival against Zionism, Israel, and the Jews. So I think all of that was the beginning of that. And in France specifically, all of this counted a lot because France was the biggest Jewish community in Europe. France was the biggest Muslim community in Europe. And France has a colonial past. France has a Holocaust past. And all of that, I think, came together. And I think we are seeing 20 years later the consequence of everything that we have not dealt with 20 years ago. But now it's everywhere. And maybe to some extent, I'd say it's probably even worse elsewhere than it is in France.
One of the observations that I had, and I also read about this a lot from studies, surveys, the demography of the surge of anti-Semitism. Are we talking about an older generation or really very young generation? I mean, how did this happen? When did they learn anti-Semitism?
So here in France we have both. First of all, we have surveys say that we have, I'd say, 3 forms of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that is traditional, old-style anti-Semitism that is more enshrined in older generation, but not only, that I would say comes from the far right. And then we have anti-Semitism that comes from within the Muslim communities here in France, and anti-Semitism that comes from within the far left. Generally, by the way, when you look at opinion polls on anti-Semitism generally, the situation hasn't worsened in the general population. When you look at opinion polls that were done back in the 60s and 70s compared to today, it's actually slightly lower in the general population than it was back then. But you have these pockets of anti-Semitism that are very strong in these three communities, and in the second and third pocket, meaning the far left and the Muslim community, it is a little bit of a generational thing, but not only. You can see it definitely amongst young people who have a lack of understanding of what's going on in the Middle East, who have a lack of an understanding of what's going on in history, of history, who are obviously hugely influenced by social media and by the algorithms and by parallel realities. But it's not only a generational issue. Actually, we'll have to dig a little bit deeper, but one of the things that we found in our last survey that we did specifically on the Muslim community was that, and it was counterintuitive because it's not what we would have expected, but on a number of key questions, the level of anti-Semitic stereotypes was actually lower amongst young people than amongst older people. So we'll have to see whether that we are preparing now. We're in the middle of the preparation of our new survey of anti-Semitism that will be released in a couple of months. So we'll have to see whether that is confirmed. But it was the first time to see that within the Muslim community that it was the factor was not age. The factor within the Muslim community was the level of practice of religion. Now, there's also several interpretations. What does it mean, the level of practice? Is it the level of belief or the level or what people are hearing in mosques? The encounters people have when they go and practice their religion in the mosque. So that's an issue of radicalization more than anything else. But that is the determining factor within the Muslim community, is the level of practice of Islam. Is the determining factor. The big problem we definitely have are young people in terms of the understanding of history. We know it now. There have been numerous surveys. Is that the young people have less and less an understanding of what happened in the Holocaust. They don't know the number of people who were killed. They don't know when it took place. People go through school, and here it's mandatory in France to learn about the Holocaust. But something is not going well because there's definitely a lack of understanding of history.
You really mentioned very important information, whether the background or the current rise. But this requires a governmental response as well. What is the government of France is doing about this?
So first of all, let me go a little bit back. 20 years ago, when anti-Semitism started here in France, it was really an explosion, because when you look at we spoke about the numbers now, but when you look at the numbers in the 1990s, you would have a few dozen anti-Semitic acts a year. So very, very low, 86, 87, 88 anti-Semitic acts a year. You go to the year of 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, it really exploded. So since then, we've never been able to go below the number of 350 anti-Semitic acts a year, which you have to understand is one a day on average for a population that represents less than 1% of the entire population. So that was back then. Back then, the government, that was Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin, didn't take it seriously. they basically said it doesn't exist. They called it hooliganism. They, for a long time, they refused to acknowledge that there was a problem. Then, with time, Nicolas Sarkozy became Minister of Interior, then became President, François Hollande, Manuel Valls. There was more and more of an understanding that there was a problem, that something had to be done about it, that it needed to be named. And so certain things have been put into place, whether it's in terms of education, whether it's in terms of security, whether it's in terms of justice and laws. But I do think that that since October 7th, and that's not only for France that is the case, that we are not at the level of commitment and sort of crisis mode, given the severity of the problem. It is as if we are commenting increases everywhere. Oh, there's 1,000% increase. Oh, there's 500% increase. Oh, they're all over the place. And as if that nothing is being really done about it. So I don't think there is sufficient, given the situation, I don't think there is sufficient attention from this government, from governments across the world, given the seriousness of the situation and the threats to Jewish life all over the world. There are things that are being done. I mean, as I mentioned earlier on October 8th, the Minister of Interior, for example, said, I will protect Jewish community sites. He also banned, for example, pro-Hamas demonstrations. So I think that sent out a strong signal in itself. Yesterday, the Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, came to Sciences Po and made it clear that this is just not unacceptable, that this is not acceptable behavior, and that the university will have to take its responsibility, and that the state itself is taking the responsibility. So there are acts of firmness. But again, I think in sort of the wider plan, I mentioned earlier on the social media, for example. I mean, we are in a total impunity. The European Union adopted what was called the Digital Services Act that came into action in August of this year. And the reality is that, theoretically platforms are supposed to be fined if they don't remove hateful content and incitement to violence. The reality, nothing really has happened. So you create a sort of sense of impunity where people feel, at the end of the day, I can say or do whatever I want. If I can say and do whatever I want, maybe I can also, hurt people because nothing is really going to happen to me. So we create a sense of impunity. And I think this really, really has to change. And again, I think governments, and this government in particular, have to rise up the level of action given the severity of the situation.
You mentioned the differences also between the 20 years ago wave and the current wave. It seems that the government needs to do more. But what is the response of the public and also the politicians in France? How are they responding to this current wave of anti-Semitism?
So I think one of the things that I think we have to understand is the level of solitude of the Jewish community for many years. When in 2006, Ilan Halimi, a young man, was abducted, tortured, and ultimately killed, I remember I went to a demonstration in the street, and there were maybe 1,000 people. I'm not saying I can recognize Jews, but I'd say maybe 99% of them were Jewish. When in 2012, 3 Jewish school children were killed, and the father, children, we're pretty much alone. Same thing. It was in between presidential, in the middle of the presidential elections. We were very alone. Same thing. And when ultimately in 2015 Charlie Hebdo happened, and then the attack on the Berkacher, most Jews were, felt a sense of warmth because people went into the streets. Millions of people went into the streets to demonstrate. But I think most Jews asked themselves the questions, and if it had only been Berkacher, how many people would have been in the streets? So for many, many years, I think there was a feeling of solitude and a feeling that civil society wasn't there. I think things have changed slightly. The demonstration on the 25th of November was an important one, where, French people decided to go into the streets of Paris, of Marseille, of Lyon, to demonstrate against anti-Semitism. And we know from our own surveys that a majority of French people, 73%, believe that anti-Semitism is not the problem of Jews alone, but of society as a whole. But then we go to the political part, because we speak about November 25th, for example, where many, many people, 80,000, I believe, were in Paris. But what happened? At the end, the Muslim organizations didn't come, because gave us an excuse that the far right was there, that Marine Le Pen was there. By the way, it doesn't, I'm not particularly overexcited to be marching next to Marine Le Pen, but that should have been a national march, just as other occasions the nation came together, and you don't count on whether it's the far right or the far left. People should be coming together. So the Muslim community decided not to come. The far left decided not to come. Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his entire party decided not to come to the march.
He also didn't actually make it clear to denounce and condemn the Hamas attack.
No, he never made it entirely clear. The party refused to call it Hamas a terrorist organization. Some members called it resistance. So politically, it's obviously, again, extremely, extremely problematic. And I have to say that even the president himself, it's not the fact that he didn't come to the demonstration. There are good reasons to say that, a president doesn't necessarily have to go and demonstrate in the streets. But what was disappointing was the explanation that was given, that somehow it would divide the nation, as if going into the streets of Paris, demonstrating against anti-Semitism would divide. It should be the exact opposite. It's a cause that should unite. Everybody should agree, just as racism, that it's wrong, that it's hurting ourselves, it's hurting our society, and people should come together to fight, to demonstrate against anti-Semitism. So that was disappointing.
Let's go a little bit away from the public and the politicians and go back to the campus, where 2 days ago an anti-Semitic incident took place. Are you concerned about the expand of anti-Semitism on campus?
Very.
They are supposed to be well-educated people. Why there is increase in anti-Semitism there?
Well, there was recently an article in the Atlantic that said, in particular, young educated people are anti-Semitic, and it's one of the problems. We see it in Harvard, we see it in Yale, we see it all over the place. I think it's an ideology that is taking over. People call it wokeness, others call it something else, but it's the idea that anti-racism is not universal anymore, and that somehow Jews are being expelled of that fight, and it's always the same ideas that somehow Jews are not pure enough. So out of this idea, there is anti-Semitism. Jews somehow become colonialist, become apartheid, become genocide, become become white, become ultra-white. And that's very dangerous. And it's particularly dangerous because that's the next generation. That's the people who will be in responsibility tomorrow, who will be the leaders, the elite of tomorrow. And that's why it's in particular extremely concerning, because we have built societies based on a certain values, and the values are reversing.
In the last remaining minute, Simone, what should the government do more?
Listen, a minute is not enough. But the first thing is firmness, absolute firmness. There needs to be, the Americans came up with something called the zero tolerance strategy. There needs to be a zero tolerance strategy. You cannot, whether it's speech, acts, behaviors, we cannot tolerate even the slightest bit of anti-Semitism. And that, I think, needs to be made clear right from the beginning. And the second thing, I think, is education. We have a big problem of education, of universal education, of coming back to the universal ideas, in particular here in France. La Déclaration Universelle des Droits de l'Homme, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And thirdly, I'd say social media. We have to tackle social media.
Thank you, Simone. This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.